Thank you very excellent. Thank you, sis. To Genesis chapter 21. We are continuing on with our lesson from last week. We only got through chapter 20 last week, and if you remember, there was this situation, if you will, between Abraham and Abimelech, and so we got a story, if you will here between Abraham and Abimelech. And as a result of that, it kind of sets the stage to what we're going to see in the latter part of chapter 21, because we'll see him show up again. But in between there, now as we go into 21, we're going to see this thing that we've all been anticipating, and that is the birth of Isaac. Before I go further, let's talk a little bit about the dynamics, if you will, of the situation with Abraham and the child and all that. So I don't want to lead us too much. I just want to see if you've all been listening. So what's the story here? Okay, so we have Abraham and we have Sarah. So as it relates to children, let's start there. What's the deal, Pickle?
Baron begin with, she had a great idea of going over there with Hagar.
Yes, all right. So Doug's right on. So in other words, here's the dynamics. And I'm going to come back to that because that is correct. But prior to that, what's the big deal about even having a kid? God's promise. God said to Abraham, your descendants are going to be like the stars of heaven, like the sands of the sea. You're going to be a blessing to the nations and all these things. But there was one problem. They had no kids. So how can you be the heir or have heirs and have descendants without those children, right? And so we've seen what God is up to, and it has, as time goes on, we see to where Abraham's faith does begin to mature and strengthen and so forth. And like all of us, our faith should get stronger, but he's kind of dropped the ball along the way. And so as time goes on, they start questioning about whether or not Abraham heard God right, because they're getting older. And when I say older, they're getting old. All right. And Sarah and him are beyond, the natural time for a female and a male to be able to produce children. We're talking 80s, 90s, 100, right? We're going to see here where Abraham's 100 by the time Isaac's born. And granted, people did live a little bit longer during that time, but they were still old, all right? And the Bible tells us they were beyond that. So the question is why would God do that? Why didn't God, like right out of the gate, say, hey, you're going to be the father of many nations and so forth, and your descendants are going to be that. By the way, have kids and let's just make this thing happen. Yeah. In other words, God's testing Abraham along the way. Here he is, this patriarch, and it gives him the opportunity to be able to grow in his faith and all of these various different type things. Well, like most of us that know God's promises are there, when they don't happen in our timeline, what has a tendency to happen? Yeah, we start getting ahead of God and we take it in our own hands. And so we know the story that Sarah, at the time Sarai, basically goes to Abraham and says, look, it just looks like it ain't going to happen. And so here is my handmaid, Hagar, and in that culture, it was not all that unusual. Have the child. He makes Hagar his wife. They have the child, and the child's name is what? Ishmael. All right. Now, Ishmael is now a child of who? of Abraham. He is a child of Abraham. Not only is he a child of Abraham, he is which number in line? He is the first in line. He is the firstborn. That's important for us to understand because traditionally, that's where all of the things happen as far as God's perspective, and usually even in that culture. That line, you would like to have thought that would come from there. But what does God say? It ain't gonna, no, it's not gonna happen through her. It's gonna be you, and it's gonna be Sarah. All right.
First, Abraham offered his favorite servant.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Miss Marilyn's reminding us, right? First of all, he's like, okay, I've got the servant, which would have been an heir, would have been part in that culture for him to, and it's like God goes, nope, that ain't going to be it. And then they have Ishmael, and no, that ain't going to be it. And if you remember correctly, who was the one who recommended that Abraham take Hagar? Sarah. Did Abraham obey his wife? Of course, right? And so I'm sorry? Yeah, right? And so he did all that. And then who didn't like it the moment that found out that Hagar was preggo? Sarah. And then so what does she do? She throws her out. She goes to Abraham and goes, that woman. He goes like, well, he's probably thinking like, oh, whatever. And so throws her out. God speaks to her. She comes back and serves her mistress, Sarah, for many years, at least close to 17 that we're getting ready to see. But now time has gone on. And it's finally that time to where the child of promise is coming. In chapter 21, verses 1 through 21, on your outline there, we have the sovereignty of God over both the child of promise and the child of the flesh. The child of promise, of course, as we're going to see, is Isaac. But God in his sovereignty is also going to have this child of the flesh, Ishmael, to be part of the picture. As a matter of fact, even to this day, the descendants are there, which also is the reality of the dynamics of the children of Abraham are both through those lines. However, the chosen line, the promised line, is going to be through Isaac. And everything beyond that. Then it splits again and so forth. And we follow the line. So God longs for us to take him at his word and trust his promises as good as done. He's told him that he's going to do. They finally get to realize, they finally step back, they finally are obedient. And in Genesis 21, verses 1 through 21, we're going to be challenged with a truthful phrase. God always performs what he promises. Therefore, we can trust in him, and he's faithful and powerful and sovereign and compassionate. And that's important for us to just wrap our heads around, because there are certain things, like, for example, let's just take a global promise right now for us as believers in this dispensation. The dispensation of the church, the bride of Christ. What is a promise that has been given to us that has not happened yet? Yes, him coming again. As a matter of fact, ever since the ascension of Christ, we have been waiting for the return of Christ. And so throughout the centuries, we can still rest on the promises that God is going to do what he said that he would do. And we have validation of that, of him fulfilling all the promises that he's already said that he would do that would take place, that already have. So that in itself. But then there's the personal promises. There's the personal things to where we see principles and promises from God that we trust in and we believe, but it may not be happening in our timeline. And that's where we have to really strengthen our faith. And it may be that God may never, he's maybe just saying no. But if there's principles that clearly is a promise and we can anticipate that, it's like it's even like the individual physical pain that we go through. All right. We have to trust that God may choose to heal us on this side, but the ultimate thing is we will be healed. We will be healed. And so even Paul cried out, with this, whatever this thorn in his flesh was, 3 times. And God said, listen, my grace is sufficient for you. And then Paul learned to accept that. Doesn't make it easy, but we have to trust. So letter A here on this, verses 1 through 8, God determines the destiny of the elect. God determines that. Let's look here in verse 1 and 2 of God's intervention, first of all, with Sarah. In chapter 21, verse 1 and 2, the Lord visited Sarah, and what are those last few words of that? As he had said. All right, so he visited her, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Now, if you remember earlier, just a chapter or two ago, we see some visitors come to Abraham, and they're having this chat with Abraham, and Miss Sarah's got her ear to the tent door, and they're basically saying, hey, listen, for sure, I'm here to tell you, you are going to have a child, and it's going to be through Sarah. And what did Sarah do? She laughed. She, ha, whatever. And I don't know if she sounded like that. It might have been, but so the messengers come and they go, hey, you laughed. And what did she say? I didn't laugh. And they go, you did so laugh, because it was beyond her comprehension in her old age to be able to do that. And so here, Sarah conceives and bears Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. So it was exactly in God's perfect timing, and it came true to what God said. Now think about that, about the age of both of them through this. And then we look in verses 3 through 5, we see here the response now of Abraham, and we're starting to see a little bit more of his maturation. He's maturing in his faith through all of these things. So the Bible tells us in verse 3 through 5, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And we all know what that means, right? Isaac means what? It means laughter, or he laughs. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. So that was like this, that was this new covenant that was made, and that was a sign of the covenant. So Abraham is moving forward with that now, just as God. Prior to that, Abraham and all his servants and all his home, all the males, even in their older age, were circumcised. But in this case now, we have the babe that is being circumcised is 8 days old, and we know that the 8 days carries forward through the law. And so when you get into the Mosaic law, it's reiterated. Verse 5, and Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. 100. Now, we live in a time and a culture right now where people are living longer, but you just don't see a lot of centurions. You just don't, even today. So that's getting up there. And so they're happy. They're incredibly happy. And there's something that is implied here that's not shown, but God gave the stamina to be able to have this child in her old age. So even though she would have had pain, like falls upon all women since the fall, it didn't kill her, right? So she's got this level of stamina. If you remember last week when we were talking about Abimelech, he basically let's go back there just a second, right? So Abimelech first of all, they go into this area, and so what does Abraham say about Sarah? She's my sister, right? And then so Abimelech, and they go like, yeah, I'll go get her. What, first of all, think about that. She's old, but she must have still been looking good, right? Yes, sir.
Well, he figures back in Genesis, so it's closer to the flood. But the foods were probably 1,000 times better than what we have today. Lifestyle was much healthier.
That's true. Well, no, amen. That's true. So there was, Rick is pointing out about just, obviously it's closer to the flood, so they did live a little bit longer, but bottom line is she's old. How do I know that? Because it says she's in her old age, but all the foods, and there wasn't all the chemicals and stuff that we have today. So yes. Yeah. Well, there is one thing that we know: he can make babies. All right, in his old age. So yeah. So I mean, it's neat though. But the neat thing is, they even know at that age that was not the time to be having a baby. All right, it just was it was a miraculous thing, and this was a child of promise, exactly as God had said, and in spite of that, and it just that basically just goes to validate this was God. And if you remember, God did not allow Abimelech to touch her, because there would have been the risk of, well, this child is probably from somewhere else. No, Abraham's line. All right, you guys get that. All right, so in verse 6 and 7, now we see the response of Sarah through this. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. In other words, joy. This is incredible. This is exciting, and this is wonderful. You can imagine what was running through her head. This is, by the way, her first child. All right. And then in verse 7, and she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So we see God here intervening. He has determined the destiny of the elect and everything that he's planned and exactly what he said. But he also, letter B in verses 9 through 21, determines the destiny of the non-elect. 14 years earlier, approximately, we know from the word of God, Hagar had given birth to Ishmael. All right. By the time Isaac was weaned, which would have been anywhere from 2 to 3 years old on average, Ishmael would have been 16 or 17 years old. All right. So he's a mid to late teenager now. Keep that in mind. All right. In verses 9 through 14, we see this separation of Hagar and Ishmael from the household of Abraham. Let's look here, first of all, in verse 9. And the child grew and was weaned, so that's Isaac. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. All right, so, there's this big, huge celebration. And notice in verse 9, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, who's that? That's Ishmael, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So we'll stop there just a moment. That word laughing in this comes from that derivative of Isaac, laughter. But in this case, it is more of a mocking type of laugh. He is mocking him. He was literally Isaac-ing him, but in a mocking way. If you remember in Genesis 16, let's turn back there very quickly. Genesis 16, look in verse 4 and 5. Genesis 16, verse 4 and 5. This is when Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham, and he went into Hagar, that was Abraham, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. In other words, and then Sarah said to him, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you my servant for you to embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. That same word there, that same type of thing that Hagar was doing here is now this kind of this mocking type of thing. All right. So that's important for us to understand. I want us all, if you will, just to kind of see. So you're going, well, what's the big deal? All right. Okay. So he's a kid. He's a teenager. He's mocking. He's laughing and stuff like that. Well, first of all, God's sovereignty and his plan is working all this out. But let's turn to Galatians. I want us to see something briefly in the book of Galatians. And in Galatians chapter 4, verse starting in verse 28, and we're going to read 28 and 29. Jared, would you please read that, verse 28 and 29?
Now two brothers and sisters, like Isaac, but children of promise. But just as then, the child born as a result of the flesh persecuted the one born as a result of the spirit, so also now.
Yeah. So in other words, here is Paul is writing to the church at Galatia. He is pointing out that there's this difference between the children of promise, the chosen line, if you will, and the children of the flesh. And he's specifically making reference here to Isaac and to Ishmael. And he points out that, but just at that time, he was born according to the flesh. That was Ishmael, persecuted him who was born according to the spirit. So is it now. In other words, that same thing still kind of happens between the flesh and the spirit as it relates to God's people, as well as even in our own lives. So that's what was happening here. His Ishmael now, as a teenager, who was daddy's boy, the firstborn, because, we know from the word of God, and we just know in general that Abraham loved Ishmael. All right. He loved him. And so now we see this child that's been weaned. And what does Abraham do? You're done weaning. Now let's have a weaning party. All right. In other words, and so that jealousy now is rising up, and he is mocking his half brother, really. Okay. Now let's see here now that in verses 10 through 13, what Sarah does all about this. And she gives him an ultimatum. Look here in verse 10 through 13. It says, so she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son. All right. Well, she's done that before. All right. Well, she's thrown out Hagar. For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. In other words, he's out of here. This is my son. He is not about to be the heir. Verse 11. And the very thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. In other words, it's like, really? Come on, we've been through this before. But God, notice now God intervenes. Verse 12. God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And then he says here what he talks about Ishmael. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because why? He's your offspring. So in other words, listen, I'll take care of him, but this is the one. And by the way, if you would have done it my way in the first place, we wouldn't be through that, but it was no surprise to God. So So she didn't want to share Abraham or Isaac with anyone, because remember here, what was also Hagar? She was also Abraham's wife. So she's kind of part of the harem here. And so she knew that Isaac would be the heir. So God tells Abraham to hearken unto Sarah. Let's all turn again to Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9. This is that sovereignty of God that we see here. We may not always understand it all, but look here in Romans chapter 9, and I'll read it for us, verse 6 through 9. But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. And not all, here's the key, are children of Abraham, because they are offspring, his offspring, I'm thinking ice cream, his offspring. But through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. For this is what the promise said, about this time next year I will return, and Sarah shall have a son. Here's the point. It is just like in anything. When you look at the line of Ishmael, who is the modern day Arab nation, that came through that line. They can say Father Abraham. The Jewish people can say Father Abraham. The Gentile through Christ can say Father Abraham. All right. But it is only the chosen, only the elect, only through the chosen line. Not everybody can say that. And that's why, for example, just as a little bit of an example, why we cannot claim ecumenicalism, to where we have all these various types of faith together and go, well, we're all come Father Abraham. Well, yeah, just flesh-wise, but not spiritual. All right. And so that's what Paul there is pointing out in Romans. But notice in verse 11 through 14 now how this distresses Abraham. Starting in verse 11. And as we just said, this very thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to the boy, be not to Abraham, don't be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham, he's obedient now, rises early in the morning, takes bread and a skin of water and gives it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Can you imagine what was running now through Abraham's mind? All right. When we think about the sovereignty of God, we have something that is very challenging, is difficult for us to wrap our heads around, and that is God's sovereignty. In other words, sovereignty means God can do what he wants, when he wants, at any time he wants, because he's God. And God has a perfect plan. He is loving. His nature does not change. But that also means that we may not fully understand all of that. And so we look at it from a worldly, fleshly, not God perspective. God has this plan, even though it wasn't like God had the plan, Abraham messed it up, now he's got to go to plan B. All right. It's all been, sovereignty of God has already been all figured out. And even if a person were to try to thwart it, you can't thwart it because God's already kind of aligned it. And that's the situation here. Now, Abraham, understandably, because he's a man, it would have been incredibly hurtful to even dream of being able to do this, to just kind of, they're literally, he's just throwing him out into the wilderness. It's not like, hey, we're right here in Claremont and, you can just go on over to Mineola and, maybe I'll check on you every once in a while. It's like, no, you're gone. And so it must have been excruciating for him. And he would have probably have never dreamed of him following through on having this relationship with Hagar, of all the pain that this would bring him. Obviously, Sarah was wrong to even suggest about that with Hagar in the first place. And Abraham was doubly wrong to act on it. But now it's like, these are the consequences of this. And so you just need to follow through and trust me. So that just goes that even in our own case, when we compromise our standards and lower our convictions, there's going to be consequences. Sometimes God in his grace still works it out in spite of us, but sometimes he doesn't. Verses 15 through 21, we see this special provision by divine intervention. God now is going to intervene to preserve Ishmael's destiny. Ishmael, God's got a plan for him. And so we just read, or we're getting ready to read here, that this sad thing that happens in verse 15 and 16. It says, when the water in the skin was gone, because they're out in the wilderness and it's desert, it's hot, she put the child under one of the bushes. Now, he's 16 or 17, all right? But he became weak, all right? Maybe, who knows all the details on why, but he obviously, she sees her son. I mean, I can remember, well, I wasn't 16 or 17, but I was older. I was quite a bit, wasn't that old, but I remember I got hurt. As a child, I remember stepping on a nail that was in a board and it just went right through my foot. Kaboing, right? Anybody ever had that done? Yeah, I mean, then, you got the tetanus shots and all that. But I remember this older lady who was a neighbor that picked me up. And I was a chunk. I mean, let's put it this way. I wasn't really fat as a kid, but I wore husky. And I remember the husky sizes, right? And so I was a little chunky. And but I remember her picking me up and running me to my mom. But my dad was at work at the time. So anyway, so that's, picture kind of this kind of happening here. And then so it says, where am I? Verse 15 and 16. She put the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. So she's quite a distance, but she can see him. She's looking over there at him, and she says, let me not look on the death of the child. And she sat opposite him, and she lifted up her voice and wept. Now, I want us to understand a little bit here too. So from the very beginning, Hagar is not the enemy, all right? She, first of all, followed through because Sarai at the time was her mistress. She had to be obedient as a slave woman. But then she comes the wife of Abraham, which was appropriate. And she's not a perfect woman, but she's been under the roof. She's been under the home of Abraham, who is a follower of Jehovah God. So the implication is either A, she has followed this God herself, but here we see she truly now is in a place where she's trusting him because she's crying out to God. Because she was a Gentile, all right? And so and then notice here it was I want us to notice something here. Let's read verse 17 through 21. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? As if he didn't know. Fear not, for God has heard the cry of the boy where he is. Now let's stop there just a moment. Notice here, I don't want to guide us, but you probably already caught it. It tells us that in verse 16, that Hagar sat opposite him and she lifted up her voice and wept. But what does it say in these other verses? The voice that God heard. The boy. She heard the cry of Ishmael. And then in verse 18, says, up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make unto him a great nation. And he does. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and she filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. Verse 21. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. It's no coincidence. Who here remembers what the name Ishmael means? You can go to chapter 16 and verse 11 if you want to cheat. No, that's what he becomes, but that's not what his name means. So, first of all, usually in the Hebrew, whenever you see the word El, it means God. So God would have been part of the name. God hears, right? His name means God hears, and God did hear him. As a descendant of Abraham, Ishmael becomes this object of God's special care, and God intervenes and takes care of him. God did not forget Hagar nor his promise. Back in 16 verse 10, he said that. And let's look here at verse 20 and 21. It says, oh, I'm in the wrong place there. There we go. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. But we know what he becomes. Let's turn back again now to chapter 16. And we see what becomes of Ishmael. God does take care of him. But in a verse 11 and 12, this is when Hagar was thrown out the first time with the baby. Verse 11 of chapter 16, and the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you're pregnant, and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. All right, so his kinsman through the flesh is through Abraham, but now he's going to Egypt. All right, and so it all starts to begin, and remember those jokes, and now it begins, right? So we see all of that starting to come together. Now we come to verses 22 through 34, where we have a different story now. It just kind of switches gears, and we come back now to Abimelech, who we learned about last week. And so faith receives guarantees of possessing God's promises. We have lots of promises that were made to Abraham, including the land and a lot of other things. In verses 22 through 32, we see this guarantee of possession of the promised land via a non-aggressive approach covenant with this Abimelech. In verse 22 and 24 specifically, we see this covenant that is addressing Abimelech's concern. Let's look here in verse 22. Now at that time, so we just left here this situation. Isaac's been born, he's been weaned. Hagar and Ishmael are now out of the picture. And so right about that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, notice here what he says, God is with you in all that you do. See, he observed God's hand in all these things, like seeing this old man having a baby, probably heard, or maybe Abraham had told him about this promise. Who knows? But he's clearly observant. And so both the political, which is Abimelech, and his military leaders of this Philistine kingdom take this initiative to approach Abraham at this crucial time. Look here now in verse 23. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. So let's step here and just talk a little bit at a moment. What's going on? Why? Anybody online can pipe up too. Just make sure you unmute yourself. Why would Abimelech say what he is saying here? There's a couple things that run through my mind. Okay, so we have the growth of Abraham's family. All right, that's one thing. What else?
What you're saying about, I see that your relationship with God is strong, basically. Well, God pretty much threatened him in a dream to touch that woman, you die, and everybody.
Right. So Abimelech's thinking about this dream that he had when God came to him and says, all right, don't touchy. And so he sees Jehovah God, the real God. What else? Yes, ma'am. Yes, right. Abraham had lied to him before, and he goes, "Listen, dude. Hey, listen. I see what's happening here. Your God is with you, no doubt. All of those different type things. Your family's growing, all of those things. But listen, I need you to swear to me by God that you are going to deal rightly with me because you lied to me in the past, right? So he's looking at the position of power and prestige that Abraham occupies." And is going to, and Abimelech and his military powers would be in a position of entreating him now to a peace pact. He's wise. He's looking ahead. He's going, listen, I kind of see the handwriting on the wall here. Let's make a peace thingy here, right? Let's continue on. Now, therefore, swear, verse 23, by God that you will not deal falsely with me, blah, 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 blah. Verse 24, and Abraham said, what? I will swear. Then, but notice now something comes up in verses 25 through 27, where there's a potential threat to this covenant that needs to be addressed. In verse 25, it says, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. So we see here, I believe, a little bit of growth on Abraham's part. In other words, he's not him-hawing around it. He's just going right at it, is my point. He's being clear, and he takes more direct and honest approach to dealing with a potential problem. He goes, well, listen, Abimelech, okay, I'm kind of with you, but we got a problem here, and that your servants had seized a well of water that we dug. It's mine. Well, that's a big deal because, let alone here, we got to have water, but out there, that's a big deal because the water goes beyond just for there, but also for the livestock and all those different type things. It was very, very important. So look at verse 26. Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this thing. You didn't tell me. So a little bit there, Abraham should have said it a little bit earlier. He's been but he's moving forward. Abraham's growing in his faith. He's trusting God. And he's like, okay, I can be a little bit clear here with Abimelech. But Abimelech says, you didn't tell me. And I have not heard of it until today. In other words, this is the first time I've heard of it. So Abimelech here is okay. And so Abraham, verse 27, took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made this covenant. And so that's just part of it. All right. So this covenant is like, okay, Here it is. I'm going to do my part, and we're going to take this a step further, because in verses 28 through 32, he's going to go, all right, we need to establish, you say, I say, we know about this. That's my well. All right. No question about it. And we need to ratify this thing to validate even further that you agree, I agree, my well. I just gave you some stuff. Here's a gift. But notice here now what he does in verse 28 through 32. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you've set apart? And he said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness from thee that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, which I've been there, really cool, because they're both both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. So there's significance here. How many here know what the word Beersheba means? Yeah, it means 7. Yeah, it's a well of 7, right? Or well of oath, right? And that oath was done with these 7 ewes. So again, it's kind of, it's like, you know, it's a little part of the story here that God's given us in his word, but there's significance here because I want us to understand something and remind us of something. Abraham dwelt in the land, but he, at this particular point, did not own anything. In other words, other than, like, he didn't take a plot of land. He lived in a plot of land. God said it was all yours. But this is a case at this particular point, he's still a sojourner around, but he's got like, listen, this well's mine. That well in that area to this day, Beersheba, still exists. All right, now it's been moved around a lot of times, and people say this is it, not it. But the point is, it was a covenant now that says, all right, this is kind of like my stake in the ground now. And if we go on a little bit further, let's see here. But we're going to notice something different here. Abimelech returned to the land of the Philistines, and Abraham, notice this is really interesting. There is this guarantee of the position of this promised land, and Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the what? Of the Philistines. So he's in that land, all right? And so he makes this memorial at this planting of this tree, this tamarisk tree. Tom Constable, who's a great Bible scholar, he points out, by planting a tree, Abraham indicated his determination to stay in that region. All right. And so tamarisk trees in Genesis 21, verse 33, were long-lived and evergreen. They lived for a very, very long time. It was an appropriate symbol of the enduring grace of the faithful God, of whom Abraham recognized as the everlasting God. Who here has the Hebrew translation of that name? Of everlasting God. Yeah, not Elohim, but El Olam. Olam, right? So it's just another name of God. We know there's all these various names, and each of them indicate his character or what he did or whatever. So now we have this place. Abraham's kind of saying, all right, I'm kind of claiming this is my spot, my well, my tree. I am just taking this very small part of this land. And there's a level of humility in a way, though, because God says, hey, listen, it's all going to be yours. All right. And, where am I? Yes, so that is the end of chapter 21. I'm ready to go into 22, but this is a whole different story now, because we get into the sacrifice of Isaac. Yes, ma'am.
Chance, I know that they didn't have chapters first, all that sort of stuff, but you have Ishmael and, what's her name, his wife, I can't even think, or her mother.
Hagar?
Hagar. And meeting a well, and then a well appears, and then all of a sudden we're talking about a well again with, Abimelech. What are the chances that that's? It's one of the same.
It's close by, but it is in a different area. Yes. Now, it's interesting you talk about Ishmael and well and all these things. If we get an opportunity next week or the week after, we'll follow along in some other places about Ishmael's line, and princes that ultimately come out of all of that. I mean, God clearly blesses Ishmael's family. And there's some wells that are involved and all those different type things. So it's a good segue to that. So I don't want to get into chapter 22 yet, because number one, you know the story. Number two, I really want to dig it, because I've got a lot of notes on chapter 22. So we'll end there. But any questions, comments, or anything about anything? Yes, ma'am.
Fill in the blank on B,
Uh,
guarantee of possession of the promised land.
B is guarantee of possession of the promised land via God's character as the everlasting God.
Just good about the tamarisk tree, sometimes it is called the eternal tree.
The everlasting or eternal tree. Yeah, he planted it. That means, can we use a Christmas tree and call it the tamarisk? Could be. Oh, tamarisk. All right. Well, I love you all. Thank you. Pray for the Lord's return between now and Sunday, but if he doesn't, we'll gather back together. Let's close in prayer. God, thank you as always for your love and your word, and for its things that we can learn. And God, you know my heart, none of us here desire to just have Bible knowledge just to be boastful and proud and to let our heads grow big because we're learning and knowing the Bible. Lord, may we learn its principles that it exposes to us, and may we be obedient, Lord, to learn from those lessons, the good and the bad. We see the faith of Abraham, and we see the failures of Abraham. And so, Lord, may that prompt us to be careful to do what you would have us to do. Father, if you do tarry till we meet together next week, Lord, may we have your blessings and protection ahead of us. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Lord bless you. God bless you. Have a good evening. All right.